The orc's house was crumbling slowly under the snow, while her little daughter burned with fever beside the dead fireplace. And when Orlena believed Thornridge would finally let them die, the way so many had always wished for in silence, a solitary hunter emerged from between the trees, carrying firewood in his arms. The roof cracked first. Orlena heard it before she saw it, a deep groaning sound like something alive giving up. A sheet of packed snow slid from the edge and hit the ground outside with a heavy thud that shook the walls. She pressed her back against the cold stone of the fireplace and looked up at the dark beams above her head, watching the thin line spreading slowly across the wood. The fire was out. She had known it was dying for hours. She had watched the last orange ember fade to grey ash while Vela slept beside her, wrapped in every blanket they owned. She had told herself she would find more wood before morning. She had told herself many things during this winter. Vela coughed. It was not the small cough of a child waking from sleep. It was the deep, rattling cough that had started 4 nights ago and had not stopped since. Orlena moved to her daughter's side immediately, pressing her palm against the girl's forehead, still burning, still too hot. "Mama!" Vela's golden eyes opened halfway. They were glassy with fever, too bright in the darkness. "I'm here." Orlena pulled the blankets tighter around those thin shoulders. "Sleep." "Is the fire coming back?" Orlena looked at the dead hearth, at the empty woodpile, at the water dripping slowly through the ceiling where the snow had pushed past the old boards above. "Yes," she said quietly, "the fire is coming back." Vela closed her eyes. Orlena stayed perfectly still for a long moment, listening to her daughter breathe. Outside, the storm had not slowed. Wind moved through the walls of the cabin like it owned the place, like it had always owned the place, like she and Vela were only guests who had overstayed their welcome. She could feel it across her ankles, across her neck, finding every crack and gap in wood that was 20 years too old. This cabin had been her husband's before it was hers. Darren had built part of it himself, had reinforced the east wall 3 winters before he died, had always said he would fix the roof before the next heavy snow. He had not. She stood slowly, her knees aching from the cold. Her hands were stiff, and she could not fully close the fingers on her left hand anymore, not in this temperature. She moved to the window and looked out at Thornridge through the small square of frosted glass. The village lights were on, warm and amber and distant, sitting on the other side of the field like something from another world. She could see the smoke rising from chimneys. Real smoke, heavy and steady, the kind that comes from a fireplace full of dry wood and enough food to cook on it. 30 years since the war ended. 30 years since her father had set down his tools in the ruins of this valley and decided that Thornridge would be rebuilt, and that he would help rebuild it. 30 years since her mother had walked these same roads carrying herbs and clean water to people who sometimes flinched when Orlena's father came too close. 30 years, and she was still standing on the outside, looking in at those amber lights. She turned away from the window. She would not go into that village tonight. She would not carry Vela through that snow and knock on those doors and watch people hesitate too long before answering. She would find wood herself. She pulled on her coat, the heavy one with the cracked leather at the elbows, and pushed open the door against the weight of accumulated snow on the other side. The cold hit her like something solid. She stepped outside. She did not see him yet. But somewhere between the black pines at the edge of the tree line, someone was already watching. She had been born screaming in the middle of a July thunderstorm, in the same bed where her mother had been born, in a small house on the eastern edge of Thornridge that smelled of dried sage and wood smoke and iron. Her father had been at the forge when it happened. Someone had run to tell him, and he had come through the door still carrying tongs in one hand, still wearing his leather apron, eyes wide and terrified in a way she had never seen again for the rest of his life. He had held her with those enormous green hands and looked at her face, her small, half-human face, her tiny ears already starting to curve to their soft points, and said something in the old Orc language that her mother had never been able to translate for her. Her mother always said it sounded like a prayer. Orlena thought about this as she pushed through the snow toward the edge of the trees. Her lantern gave off almost no warmth, just a thin yellow circle of light that the wind kept trying to swallow. Her boots broke through the crust of ice with every step, dropping her knee-deep into the packed white underneath, and each step out again cost her more than she had. She had been running out of things to spend since October. She remembered being 7 years old and running these same fields in summer, bare feet on warm grass, chasing the older boys from the village through the barley that her mother's neighbour grew along the eastern fence. She remembered how the barley smelled when it was tall, that heavy golden smell of something almost ready. She remembered thinking with complete and uncomplicated certainty that she belonged to this place the way the barley did. She was 12 when that certainty first cracked. It had been a small thing, a woman at the market, a woman Orlena had seen every Saturday her entire life, who had moved her basket to the other side when Orlena's hand accidentally brushed it, reaching for a jar of honey. It was a tiny motion. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. She had not said a word to her mother about it. She had not said a word about any of the small things that followed, gathering slowly over the years like snow on a weak roof. Each one light enough to dismiss, all of them together more than the wood could bear. Her father had known. She understood that now, looking back. He had known because he had lived it longer and in harsher ways than she ever would, and he had chosen to stay anyway. To stay and work and build and be useful and visible and patient, even when patience cost him pieces of himself she never got to see. He had died when she was 19. The forge fire, the doctor had called it, his lungs had given up. Her mother had lasted 3 more winters. Then there was Darren, quiet and kind, with rough hands and a way of laughing that made small rooms feel larger. Darren, who had looked at her without flinching. Darren, who had built this cabin. Darren, who had left her alone in it. She stopped at the tree line. The cold was inside her now, not just outside. It had found the same cracks as the wind. She bent and grabbed at a fallen branch, but it was green wood, useless, wet through. She straightened and looked deeper into the forest. Dark between the pines. Very dark. She took 1 step forward, and her left leg went through ice into water, and she went down hard, both hands slapping into snow, lantern swinging wide and nearly going out. She pushed herself up. She stood. She looked up. Between 2 large snow-covered pines, about 40 feet away, there was a shape that was not a tree, a man, very tall, very still. Orlena opened her mouth. The shape moved back 1 step into the darkness and was gone. She stood in the cold, breathing hard, staring at empty forest. Then she turned and walked back to the cabin. Darren's coat still hung on the hook beside the door. She walked past it every day and never moved it. She was not sure why. Maybe because moving it meant making a decision about what to do with it, and making that decision meant acknowledging something she preferred to leave slightly unclear inside herself, like a room she had not cleaned yet. She came back inside and stood dripping near the cold fireplace, snow melting off her boots onto the dirt floor. Vela had not moved. Her breathing had steadied slightly, or maybe Orlena only wanted to believe it had. No wood. She had come back with nothing. She sat down heavily in the chair by the hearth, the chair that had been Darren's chair, the one with the uneven leg that rocked slightly to the right. She remembered him fixing that leg 3 separate times, each time certain he had solved it, and each time it came back within a week. He had finally just accepted the tilt and called it character. Darren had been good at accepting things. She was not. She had tried to be. She had practiced the particular stillness that survival required, had learned to keep her jaw quiet and her eyes forward when someone in Thornridge said something that cut. She had learned to be small in the ways that made other people comfortable, and large only in the ways that kept her daughter fed. It was exhausting work, the kind that left no visible mark but hollowed you from inside the way water hollows stone. Last winter, when Darren had come back from the mountain pass, with the cough already in his chest, she had tried to be still about that too. She had made tea and changed his blankets, and told Vela her father was only resting. She had sat beside him at night, after Vela slept, and held his hand, and listened to his breathing the way she was listening to Vela's now. He had made her promise to stay in Thornridge. "Your roots are here," he had said. Near the end, his voice had sounded like paper by then. She had not argued with him. It had not seemed kind to argue. But roots only hold if the ground holds too, and she was not sure any more that Thornridge had any intention of holding her. She stood up and began doing what she always did when she could not afford to feel something. She moved. She checked the door. She checked the window seal. She checked the small space under the bed, where she kept the dried corn that was nearly gone now. She counted. She reorganized. She made the thing in front of her smaller than the thing inside her. When she came back to the fireplace, something had changed. She stopped. There was wood piled beside the door. She'd not noticed it when she walked in. She had been too cold, too tired, too inside her own head. But there it was. A generous stack of split logs, dry and pale at the cut ends, smelling of pine resin and something else, something like cold air and distance. Someone had been here. While she had been in the forest, someone had come to her door and left firewood without knocking. She stood very still, listening. Wind, nothing else. She crossed to the pile slowly, as if it might disappear if she moved too fast, and picked up the top log. It was warm compared to everything else in the cabin. Freshly cut, not old wood salvaged from somewhere, cut specifically, carried here specifically. She built the fire with her hands shaking, not entirely from cold. When the first flame caught, Vela stirred under her blankets and turned toward the heat without waking, her small face relaxing from something pinched and painful into something closer to rest. Orlena watched her daughter breathe. Outside, the storm moved on. By morning, the snow had stopped falling, but the cold had deepened, the way it always did after a storm, like the sky was pressing down harder now that it was empty. Vela woke with a slightly lower fever and managed to eat half a bowl of thin broth, which Orlena counted as a substantial victory. She did not sleep. Instead, she sat by the fire she had kept burning through the night, feeding it one log at a time, making the pile last, watching the door. Whoever had left that wood had not come back. She had heard nothing through the walls, seen no movement through the frost-clouded window glass. Just the wind, just the trees, just the long silence of a valley under winter. She should have been grateful. She was grateful. She was also unsettled in a way she could not fully name, the way you feel unsettled when something good happens without explanation. Because unexplained kindness in a place that has mostly shown you its harder face tends to carry weight you cannot immediately measure. When Vela fell back asleep after the broth, Orlena allowed herself to sit still for the first time in days. She thought about the shape between the trees. She had not been afraid exactly. That surprised her. She had been startled, and then she had been something more complicated, aware, present, alert in a way that was different from fear, the way an animal lifts its head when it hears something unexpected, not fleeing yet, only paying attention. He had been tall. That was what she had registered first. Tall and completely still, like someone who had learned long ago that stillness is its own kind of speech. She forced herself to stop thinking about it, and went to check the remaining food. 2 days of dried corn if she stretched it. Some dried herbs she had been saving for Vela's fever, half a jar of something that had once been pickled turnips and was now mostly brine. She needed to go into the village. The thought sat in her chest like a stone. She had not been to Thornridge proper since November, when she had gone to sell the last of the late autumn work she had done, mending for 3 different families. The kind of quiet, invisible labor that people accepted from her hands, without necessarily accepting the hands themselves. She had come back with just enough coin for the corn and the herbs, and the knowledge that at least 2 people had paid her less than they would have paid anyone else, and had done so without apology. Darren had always said she should push back harder. She had always said there was a cost to pushing back that he did not fully calculate, because he had not grown up the way she had grown up in this particular place, among these particular people. He had listened. He had never completely understood. She packed Vela under every blanket and opened the door. The cold air came in like a wall, and there, stacked neatly against the side of the cabin, was another pile of firewood, even larger than the first, topped with 3 pieces of wrapped cloth that she slowly unwrapped to find dried venison, still cold and firm, enough to last a week. She stood in the doorway for a long time. Then she looked toward the forest. Nothing moved. But somewhere deep in the pines, she thought she could hear the sound of an axe, steady, rhythmic, patient, like someone who had been working for a while and intended to work for a while more. She stood there until her ears were numb. Then she went inside and fed her daughter. Thornridge in winter looked the same as it always had and completely different depending on where you stood. From the high road coming down from the eastern fields, it looked like any other valley settlement. Clustered rooftops, smoke rising, the wooden frame of the mill visible against the grey sky, the frozen creek running quiet between the market square and the old smith quarter where her father's forge had stood. From that distance it was almost beautiful. You had to be inside it to feel the other thing. Orlena walked through the main street with her chin level and her shoulders straight, the way her mother had taught her when she was small. "You walk like you belong," her mother had said. "Because you do." She had practiced that walk her entire life. She was still practicing it. People noticed her. They always did. Some nodded, the quick, minimal nod that acknowledges presence without inviting it. Some looked away with the particular deliberateness of people who have made a decision and would prefer you not require them to examine it. An older man she recognized as someone who had once bought butter from her mother paused in front of the dry goods store and watched her pass with an expression she could not read and did not try to. She went to the supply counter at the trading post and asked about work. The man behind the counter, young, someone she did not know well, looked at her for a moment with careful neutrality before telling her there was nothing at present. She asked about credit. He told her the same. She thanked him in the flat, even voice she used in these situations, the voice that was perfectly polite and revealed nothing, and walked back out into the cold street. She stood outside for a moment, hands folded inside her coat sleeves, and allowed herself exactly 3 breaths of feeling. Then she moved on. She was passing the side alley beside the tavern when she heard voices. "It doesn't belong on that land. Never did. Her father was a—" She did not stop walking. "Man from the mountains, you said. The one who fought on the frontier. Crow. Someone called him—" She slowed, asking questions about who's been going up that way. "Wallace wants to know." Orlena turned the corner and kept walking as if she had heard nothing, but she filed it away, the name rising through the winter air like smoke. Crow. She had heard that name once before from old Daria Vale at the edge of the market, said in the tone people use for things that are both frightening and oddly respected. A man who came down from the mountains when the cold got bad. A man who had done things during the border conflicts that nobody talked about specifically, but everybody implied. A man who had been living alone up there for so long that some people in Thornridge had mostly forgotten he was real. She bought a small amount of coarse salt with the last of her coin. It was not what she needed, but it was something, and something always felt better than nothing, even when the math did not support it. On the way back out of the village, she passed Wallace Grent's property. He was standing at his gate, watching her. Not doing anything, just watching with those small, cold eyes in that broad, weathered face, the way a man watches something he has already made up his mind about. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she turned and walked home. She found his cabin by following footprints. She had not meant to. She had been moving along the tree line, gathering the green-tipped branches that burned poorly, but burned. And the tracks were simply there in the fresh snow, large and evenly spaced, heading north and upward into the denser forest. She had followed them the way you follow a question you are not sure you want answered, slowly and with pauses, giving herself many chances to turn back. She did not turn back. The forest changed as she climbed. The pines grew taller and farther apart, and the snow between them was deep and undisturbed, except for the track she followed and the occasional small disturbance of a bird or something smaller. The light came through grey and flat, and the cold up here was cleaner somehow, sharper in the lungs, less hostile, more simply honest about what it was. She heard the cabin before she saw it, the low sound of fire and something else. A rhythmic knock that she eventually identified as a shutter moving against its frame in the wind. Then it appeared between the trees. Small, solid, dark wood. Low roofline heavily packed with snow, one window with actual glass, steamed from inside. A wood pile along the left wall that was enormous and organized with a precision that looked almost obsessive. A rack of tools beside the door, each one hung carefully, each one clean. She stopped at the edge of the clearing. She should not be here, she knew that. She had followed a stranger's footprints into the mountain forest without telling anyone, with her daughter asleep and fevered in a cabin below, and she was standing in the trees, staring at a house belonging to a man she did not know. She turned to leave. "You might as well come in." The voice came from her left, not from the cabin. She turned. He was standing at the far edge of the woodpile, about 10 feet away. He had clearly circled the cabin from the north side. There was a separate trail of tracks looping wide through the pines behind him, the deliberate arc of a man who had noticed he was being followed and had moved quietly to a different position before she arrived. Someone accustomed to not being surprised in his own territory. He was exactly as tall as she had registered from a distance, very tall, with a heaviness to his frame that came from actual work rather than bulk. Grey-bearded, dark hat pulled low, eyes that were grey or green, she could not tell in this light, only that they were watching her with an attention that was not hostile but was very complete. He was holding a dead rabbit in his left hand. He was looking at her the way you look at something that does not entirely surprise you. "I'm not," she started. "I know," he said. "You're cold. Come in." He walked past her toward the cabin door. He did not wait for her response. He simply went inside and left the door open. She stood for another moment in the cold, then she followed. Inside was exactly what the outside had suggested. Organized, quiet, functional. A fire large enough to matter, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of tools and dried food, and several things she could not identify from where she stood. The smell of pine smoke and old leather and something animal that was not unpleasant. He had hung the rabbit on a hook near the door and was now feeding the fire without looking at her. She sat in the chair nearest the warmth. For a long time, neither of them spoke. It was, she realized slowly, the most comfortable silence she had experienced in over a year. Vela met him on the 4th day. Orlena had not planned it that way. She had gone up to the cabin alone each time, leaving Vela dozing by the fire in the lower cabin with instructions not to open the door for anything. The visits were brief, an hour, sometimes less. She was not sure what drew her back. She only knew that the silence up there was different from the silence down here, that one was empty and one was full, and she had been sitting in empty for too long. On the 4th day, Vela had woken and followed her. Orlena heard the snow creak and turned to find her daughter standing 20 feet back on the path, wrapped in 2 coats that were too big and 1 boot that was not properly laced. eyes wide and completely unashamed of herself. "Vela." "I wanted to see where you go," Vela said simply. Orlena should have taken her back. She had told herself the hill was too steep, the cold too sharp, the situation too undefined. Instead, she looked at her daughter's face, flushed with recovered health, alive with curiosity, the golden eyes bright in a way they had not been bright for weeks, and made a different calculation. "Come on then," she said. Elias was outside when they arrived, reinforcing something on the east wall of the cabin. He heard them on the path and turned, and his face did the thing it always did when something surprised him, a slight, controlled stillness, like a held breath. His eyes moved from Orlena to Vela. Vela looked up at him with the frank, unfiltered assessment of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to pretend she was looking at something else. "You're very tall," Vela said. "I am," Elias said. "Mama is tall too, but not like you." "No," he agreed. "Are you the one who brought the firewood?" He looked at Orlena. She said nothing. "Yes," he said. Vela considered this. "Why?" Elias was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone avoiding the question, but the quiet of someone treating it with the seriousness it deserved, which Orlena found herself grateful for. "Because it was cold," he said. Vela nodded as if this were perfectly sufficient, which apparently it was, because she then looked at the wall he had been working on and asked whether he needed help, and the conversation moved forward and did not return. They stayed for most of the afternoon. Elias showed Vela how to identify which wood was dry enough to burn by sound, the hollow knock of good firewood against green. She knocked every piece of the woodpile twice. He let her. He made tea on the iron stove, the dark, bitter kind that Orlena's mother had used to drink, and when Vela wrinkled her nose at it, he produced a small amount of something sweetened from a high shelf, without comment. Toward the end of the afternoon, while Elias was washing the teacups at the basin near the window, Vela disappeared outside for a few minutes. She came back with her small fist closed around something. She walked directly to Elias and held it out without preamble. It was a piece of quartz, pale and cloudy, smoothed by years in the creek bed. It caught what little light remained in the room and threw it back fractured and soft. "I found it in the snow by the door," Vela said. "It was shining." Elias looked at the stone for a moment. Then he took it from her palm very carefully, the way you take something that is being trusted to you, and turned it once between his fingers. "Thank you," he said. There was something in his voice that had not been there before. He folded it into his shirt pocket and patted it once, and Vela smiled the wide smile she had not smiled in weeks, and Orlena had to look away toward the window for a moment before she could arrange her face again. In the late afternoon, while Vela was drawing shapes in the condensation on the window glass, Orlena stood by the fire and felt something shift in her chest. Something that had been locked down since Darren died, since before Darren died, since a very long time ago. It was not happiness exactly. It was something quieter and more careful than happiness. It was the feeling of being in a room where you did not have to rehearse how you were standing. She was still not sure what to do with that, but she let herself feel it just for a moment before going to collect her daughter for the walk back down the hill. Wallace Grent came on a Thursday. She knew something was wrong before she opened the door. She could hear the horses, more than one, and the particular sound of men who are trying to sound casual and failing. She had grown up around the sounds of Thornridge, and she knew how it sounded when a group of people had decided something collectively and were now acting on it with the moral confidence that comes from having decided together. She opened the door. 4 men, Wallace in front, 2 of his neighbours just behind him, and a younger man at the back whose father had been, she distantly recalled, some kind of deputy during the years after the war. All of them on horseback. All of them looking at her cabin with the studied neutrality of people who had already had the conversation they needed to have and were now only here for the formality. "Orlena," Wallace said. He always said her name the way you say the name of something that should not require naming. that slight pause beforehand, that small compression of the lips. "Wallace," she said, "we've been having some discussions in the village." He looked past her into the cabin, at Vela, who was sitting by the fire drawing, who looked up without moving. "About this property, the deed situation." "The deed situation," she repeated. "Your husband's deed specifically. And the question of whether the arrangement still—" "The arrangement," she said, "is that my husband purchased this property, that I am his widow, and that this is my home." Wallace's jaw tightened. "There are some who feel—" "I know what some feel, Wallace." She kept her voice even. She was good at keeping her voice even. She had practiced it since she was 7 years old. "I've known what some feel for most of my life. It hasn't changed the deed." The horses shifted. The younger man at the back was not looking at her, was looking at the tree line, and his expression was slightly different from the others. Not convinced, not quite comfortable, the look of someone still deciding. Wallace drew a long breath through his nose. "This winter has been hard on everyone. If you were to—" A sound from the edge of the forest stopped him. Not a loud sound, just footsteps on snow, slow and steady and completely unhurried. Everyone turned. Elias Crow came out of the trees with an axe on his shoulder and 2 rabbits hanging from his left hand, and the particular quality of movement that very large men who have done dangerous things for a very long time sometimes have. Quiet, calibrated, each step placed exactly where it belongs. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at the 4 horses and the 4 men on them. He did not raise the axe. He did not raise his voice. He did not do anything except stand there with those steady grey-green eyes, moving slowly from one face to the next, with an attention that was not threatening, but was completely unambiguous. Wallace held his posture for exactly as long as it takes a man to realize he has miscalculated the room. "Crow!" he said. Elias said nothing. The silence lasted about 15 seconds. Then Wallace pulled his horse around with more force than necessary, and the other men followed, and the sound of hoofbeats receded down the path toward the village, and then it was very quiet. Orlena let out a breath she had been holding since she opened the door. Elias walked forward and set the rabbits down on the low wall beside the door and looked at her. "All right?" he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He picked up the axe again and did not leave. He went to the damaged section of the cabin wall, the east side, where the boards had warped badly under the weight of accumulated ice, and began working at it with the flat of the blade, testing each plank, pulling the worst ones away and setting them aside. He worked slowly and without asking permission, the way a person works when they have simply decided that something needs doing. Orlena watched him from the doorway. She had not asked. He had not offered. He had simply begun. He worked until the light went low and grey, replacing 3 boards from a stack of spare lumber he had apparently brought along and left near the tree line before the confrontation. When he was done, the east wall held the cold back in a way it had not managed all winter. He gathered his tools. "Elias." He stopped. "Why do you keep coming back?" He was quiet for a moment. She watched the muscles in his jaw move slightly, the way they did when he was choosing words carefully. "Because," he said, "I know what it looks like when someone is deciding whether to stop fighting." He looked at her, just briefly, with something behind the usual controlled stillness, something she had not seen there before. "You haven't stopped," he said. "That matters." Then he walked back into the trees, and she stood in the doorway for a long time, not going inside. The snow began to pull back from the south fields on a Tuesday morning, which was nobody's doing and everyone's relief. Orlena noticed it first by the sound. The steady, quiet drip from the eave above the window, the water finding its way down through the packed layers. The first suggestion of something underneath all that white that was not finished yet. She stood at the window with her tea and watched a thin, dark line of exposed earth appear along the base of the old fence post, just a stripe of brown in all that white, small enough to dismiss and impossible to ignore. Spring did not arrive. It only suggested that it was thinking about arriving, which, after this particular winter, was enough to make her throat tighten. She had told Elias the night before. She had gone up to the cabin after Vela was asleep, which she had done twice in the past week, walking the familiar path with the lantern, and the feeling that this was becoming a different kind of familiar, not the anxious habit of a woman seeking warmth out of necessity, but something more deliberate than that. She had stood in the doorway and said, "I think we should come up here permanently." He had not responded immediately. He had been cleaning one of the old tools by the fire, moving a cloth along the handle with the slow, methodical patience that was simply how he moved through all things. He had set the tool down. "That would be a change," he'd said. "The cabin below is not going to survive another winter. I know that now. Even with what you repaired, the roof, the frame. It's too far gone." He nodded once. "And Vela—" She stopped, tried again. "She's been happier up here these past weeks. She could not finish that sentence either, because finishing it required acknowledging something she was not sure she had the right language for yet. He had looked at her for a long moment. Just that. Looking. "There's a room," he said finally. "On the north side. I've never done anything with it." That was all he said. That was enough. Now, in the morning light, she folded the last of their things into the 2 large bags she owned, the ones with the worn straps that Darren had bought at the market years ago. She folded them carefully. She took down the photograph above the fireplace, the only one they had, a small daguerreotype of Darren and herself, standing in the summer sun outside this same door, both of them squinting into the light. She wrapped it in the cleanest cloth she had and placed it at the top of the bag. She left the coat on the hook. She had thought about this. She had stood in front of it for a long time this morning, and then she had decided to leave it, because this cabin did not belong to anyone else, and no one would come to take it, and the coat belonged to this place in a way that was its own kind of memorial. Darren had lived and worked and been warm in these walls. That did not stop being true. She let it stay. Vela was already outside when Orlena came to the door, boots properly laced for once, standing in the melting snow with her small pack on her back, looking up the hill toward the tree line with an expression of pure forward attention. "Ready?" Orlena said. "Elias is up there," Vela said, as if this were an answer, which it was. They walked up the hill together, the path already familiar under their feet, each tree recognizable now, each bend in the trail something she had committed to without deciding to. The morning was grey and cold, but the drip from the branches was audible all around them, that constant quiet sound of things releasing what they had been holding. Elias was at the woodpile when they came into the clearing. He saw them and set down the axe, and did not say anything for a moment, only looked at them both with that complete, unhurried attention. Then he said, "I'll put water on." He went inside. Orlena stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked back down the hill through the trees, at the pale valley below, at the distant cluster of Thorn Ridge rooftops, at the fields beginning to show their first dark lines through the white. She had grown up down there. She had buried people she loved down there. She had carried that place in her chest for 30 years, like something between a wound and a gift, never fully one and never fully the other. She would carry it still. She knew that. But standing here at the top of this hill, with the sound of fire starting inside, and her daughter already at the door, pulling off her boots, and the smell of pine and meltwater, and a morning that was honestly itself, she put her hand against the doorframe. The wood was solid. It had been built to last. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her, gently. The way things close when they are not running away from something but simply arriving. The fire was already warm. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-Bound Legacy.